Hello everyone, welcome to the last lecture, and this one is titled Preserving Biodiversity. Um, the first thing I want to talk about is this word biodiversity. Previously, scientists might have talked about biodiversity in terms of the number of species and the number of individuals in each of those species, and that still works. However, it's not always the best way to measure biodiversity when we talk about um, deciding how we should protect it. And we'll talk about why that might be the case in a slide just in a bit. Biologists now use measures of biodiversity at several levels of organization, including genes, populations, and ecosystems. And that just helps to focus efforts to preserve the important elements of biodiversity. Um, First question I'd like to answer for you is, why should I care about preserving biodiversity? Here's three organisms: the woolly mammoth, the dodo bird, and the passenger pigeon. And these three organisms have all gone extinct in relatively short amounts of time. Uh, when we talk about going back just a few hundred years. Now, a few hundred years might sound like a long time, but in an ecological setting, or when we talk about the history of organisms and really just life on this planet, that's really a small amount of time. These organisms are all part of what is called the Holocene mass extinction event. There's been 5 mass extinction events throughout time, and we're currently in the Holocene, which is the man-made mass extinction event. Um, and that's the Holocene is the 6th mass extinction event. But it's supposedly all because of human interactions. And so um, here we see the woolly mammoth. He went extinct about 10,000 years ago. Here's the passenger pigeon. The last passenger pigeon, her name was Martha. She never was able to produce a viable egg. She died in a Cincinnati zoo in 1914. By the way, these passenger pigeons, they used to be so numerous that when they would flock or when they'd fly around, they would actually black out the sun. And lastly, the dodo bird. The dodo bird went extinct in 1681. Now, they didn't evolve with humans, so they would actually walk right up to European settlers who would eat them, or the dogs and cats that they brought with them would eat them, or their eggs. And so they went extinct really, really quickly. So why should we care? Those things all died off so long ago. How is the loss really important in terms of welfare for me or the human species, let's just say? Um, would those species have made our lives any better? And so, if you look at it from the perspective of evolution and ecology, maybe the loss of one particular species, maybe with some exceptions, that might seem unimportant. But the current accelerated extinction rate that we're seeing today means the loss of tens of thousands of species within our lifetime. Much of this loss is occurring in the tropical rainforests. The biome that I told you has most of the life's diversity. We're seeing most of the loss occurring there. Um, Remember, they're the especially high diversity ecosystems that are being cleared for timber and agriculture. Um, so the loss of all of these organisms is likely to have dramatic effects on human welfare through the collapse of ecosystems and added in costs to maintain food production, clean air, and water. All of those things affect human health. So it's not just about losing a single individual species, it's the cascading effects that happen from losing thousands of them. Um, we used to be very, very aware of the impact that the environment had on our health. However, the sort of cultural transition that we've made has made it difficult for us to recognize the dependence of that we have on living things other than maybe crops and the domesticated animals that we use for food. But really, we are really, really dependent on all living things. Today, our technology sort of smooths out the extremes of existence, right? Unless you are always hunting and fishing and growing your food, you don't really ever have to think about it. You just know that you go to the store to get it. It leads to more comfortable lives, but ultimately, we would not be able to exist without our surrounding ecosystems. Our ecosystems provide our food. That includes the living plants that grow in soil ecosystems and the animals that eat those plants, as well as the photosynthetic organisms in the oceans and the organisms that eat them. So our ecosystems have provided many of the medications that maintain our health, because those are commonly made from compounds found in living organisms. The ecosystems provide our clean water, which is maybe held in lakes, rivers, or passes into the groundwater. So if we lose the diversity and we lose ecosystems, we lose our chance of survival as well. So how do we measure biodiversity again? Remember I said there's a few different ways now: genetic diversity, population diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Let's talk about them. Genetic diversity, we look at this picture here of these dogs. They're all dogs, right? They're pretty cute, huh? But Chihuahuas, Rottweilers, Pit Bulls, they're all dogs, but they're not the same because they are genetically different. And so, let's just, for example, say that you could say, well, we'll protect this. I really, is this some sort of lab maybe, or this brown chocolate lab? We'll protect labs, and so protections go in place for labs, but they don't go in place for these poodles. Well, this is trying to make it very simple, but somebody really likes poodles, but if we don't protect them, then we lose the genetic diversity within this species of dog. And now, you might think, well, we still have dogs, but we only have the genetic diversity of labs instead of poodles or chihuahuas or rottweilers, whatever one you want to select. So scientists will use genetic diversity as the key factor for preserving biodiversity, saying that we need to make sure that the populations of species have enough genetic diversity so that we encompass enough diversity within the entire species. Here's an example where diversity of the genetics is really, really low. As a species, cheetahs have famously low levels of genetic variation, and that's probably because they went through some sort of bottleneck effect that they experienced 10,000 years ago. If you remember what the bottleneck effect is, it's when some sort of act occurs upon the population where only a few numbers of individuals survive, and they go on to survive and reproduce the next generation. And really, if you look at a cheetah, at its genetics, they're almost identical. They're almost clones of each other. They're so identical. They're so identical that if you were to take a skin graft from one and put it on the wound of another, it will take 100% of the time. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is, if some sort of disease occurs that makes one of these cheetahs susceptible, every single other cheetah will be susceptible to it as well. So unfortunately, the genetic diversity, the population diversity of cheetahs is very, very low. And that's scary to think, because it only takes one disease or one sickness that could potentially wipe out the entire species. Okay, here's ecosystem diversity. Um, Ecosystem diversity is the number of different ecosystems on Earth or in a geographical region. Whole ecosystems can disappear, okay? Even if some of the species might survive by adapting to other ecosystems, the loss of an ecosystem would mean the loss of the interactions between species, the loss of unique features of that ecosystem, and the loss of the biological productivity that an ecosystem is able to create. One example of a now largely extinct ecosystem right here in North America is the prairie. Prairies once spanned central North America all the way from northern Canada down into Mexico. It was basically the entirety of middle central North America. they're now all but gone because they've been replaced by crop fields or pasture lands and suburban sprawl. Many of the species that lived there were able to survive, except for one we're going to talk about, the American bison or the American buffalo. But the hugely productive ecosystem that was once there, that was responsible for creating our most productive agricultural soils, is now gone. The consequence of that is that the soils that are now being used to grow the food that we need are being depleted unless they are maintained artificially at a very huge cost. The decline in soil productivity occurs because the interactions that were there in the original ecosystem have been lost. So that's a far more important loss than the relatively few species that were driven extinct. It was just the ecosystem service of having that really productive soil is now gone. So once again, just because some of the species were able to survive, really that would pale in comparison to the ecosystem service that we lost. One example of a species that really suffered when we lost the prairie was the North American bison. And you could call them bison, you can call them buffalo. Really, the correct term is bison. However, Native Americans called these guys buffalo, and they are cousins of the Asian buffalo, so it's a fine term to use as well. Tens of millions of bison used to roam North America when the Europeans first arrived. They were the North American continent's largest land mammal. Bison were crucial in shaping the prairie ecosystem. Um, their massive size made them prey for prairie wolves, even though they're formidable prey, but they were prey nonetheless. They were prey for grizzly bears, and they were prey items for Native Americans. Um, when those carcasses died, they would offer nourishment to smaller animals and plants when they released the carbon within their bodies. So not only did the bison nearly vanish because of overhunting in the late 1800s, but whenever they left, so too were their effects they had on the prairie ecosystem. Um, they are recovering now because a lot of research and a lot of money has been put into it, but only about 20,000 exist on in herds right now, and most of those herds are very, very small herds of about 100 or so, which is much, much less than is needed for their effects to be felt. And so that's really an unfortunate example of another species that has been decimated um, due to human effects. Okay, but once again, I just want to point out that really the more devastating loss was the loss of the prairies themselves. Okay, just wanted to put this data up here. It shows the considerable effort that has been put in place to describe the biodiversity on this planet. What you can see, and there's three different sources here, but from all of them, what you can see is that what we have described constitutes much less than what we believe actually exists. So animals, for example, we have described, science has given names to so different sources have used different data, but over 1 million species. We've named over 1 million species. What scientists predict actually exist is 9 million or 7 million or 10 million. So these are all based on different mathematical equations, but you can see that we've described much less than what is predicted to actually exist. Um, and even with what is known, there's no centralized repository of names or samples of the species. And so therefore there's really no way to be sure that the 1.1 or 1.5 million descriptions is even accurate. It's at best a guess based on opinions of experts on different taxonomic groups. And given that right now the Earth is losing species at an accelerating pace, we're never even sure about what's being lost. Okay? When you get down to things like protists and prokaryotes and fungi, it's even harder to describe because they're microscopic. And so really, we're never going to know exactly what's been around we find somewhere estimated, I read 20,000 to 40,000 species every year, but we're losing way more than that. So we'll never be able to describe everything, but it's just crazy to think about everything that maybe exists and maybe has already gone extinct before we could ever describe it. Okay, let's take a look at this slide because I want to point out one thing. Mass extinction events are not something that is brand new. In fact, paleontologists have identified 5 strata in the fossil record that appear to show sudden and dramatic, and by that I mean greater than half of all living species disappearing from the fossil record. These are called mass extinctions. In most cases, the hypothesized causes are still controversial, but however, in one, which is the most recent, the cause seems clear. The most recent extinction was about 65 million years ago, the in Cretaceous extinction, and that saw the disappearance of the dinosaurs and many, many other species. Most scientists now agree that the cause of this extinction was the impact of a really large asteroid in somewhere in the present-day Yucatan Peninsula. And there's a lot of data that supports that it was this asteroid impact that killed all of them. Now, what I want to point out is that these mass extinction events have happened all throughout history. However, what we're seeing now, the rate at which we're seeing extinctions is even higher than these mass extinctions, and that is the sixth, or what we call the Holocene mass extinction. It has mostly to do with the activities of us, Homo sapiens. There are numerous recent extinctions of individual species that are recorded in human writings. We talked about a few of them, and most of those coincide with the expansion of European colonies in the 1500s. So here's just a few that we've lost: the dodo, the passenger pigeon, the quagga, the golden toad, the Tasmanian wolf. Things that are extinct in the wild are the Bornean orangutan, the red panda are under critical threat. The green turtles are endangered, so is the great white shark. And anyway, as you keep going on, all of these organisms are moving towards this unfortunate extinction event. And that, once again, it has everything to do with human interactions. So, how do we conserve biodiversity? This is not something new, okay? People have been talking about the threats to biodiversity for some time. The first national park was set aside, which was Yellowstone Park, in 1890. Attempts to preserve nature for various reasons have occurred for centuries. Today, the main efforts to preserve biodiversity involve legislative approach that regulate human activities and corporate behavior. And a lot of that has to do with setting aside protective areas and habitat restoration. Establishment of wildlife and ecosystem preserves, it's going to be one of the key tools in conservation efforts. A preserve is an area of land that's set aside. It'll have various degrees of protection for the organisms that exist within the boundaries of this preserve. You take a look at this picture, that's the Grand Teton National Park. Preserves can be effective for protecting species and ecosystems, but they have some pretty serious drawbacks. A simple measure of success in setting aside preserves for biodiversity protection is to set a target percentage of land or marine habitat to protect. However, a more detailed preserve design and choice of location is usually necessary because of the way the protected lands are usually handed out. And usually they're handed out because those lands are less economically valuable. So then rather than being set aside specifically for the species or the ecosystems that are at risk, they're kind of just like, here's a lot of land that doesn't really benefit us economically, so we won't touch it. And, Some of that is good, but sometimes we're not really getting at the main cause for concern. So it's estimated that 11.5% of Earth's land surface was covered by preserves of various kind. And that's good, and that's even greater than some previous goals. However, when you really look at the data, that protected land only represents 9 out of the 14 recognized major biomes. So 5 biomes where we don't have any protected land. And research has shown that 12% of all species live outside of preserves. And then when you look at percentages of threatened species, those are even worse. Um, the percentages are much higher when you look at threatened species because they are only considered when only high quality preserves are considered. So one example of how bad it is that high quality preserves, the best of the best, only include about 50% of the threatened amphibian species. And so really some information came out in in 1988, and this was the biodiversity hotspot idea. So it's a concept that was developed by this scientist Norman Myers in, like I said, 1988. And he said that hotspots are going to be geographical areas that contain high numbers of endemic species. An endemic species is a species that's only found in that area. The purpose of that concept was to identify important locations on the planet for conservation efforts, a kind of conservation triage, right? So if we protect hotspots, governments are able to protect a larger number of species, right? Instead of just saying like, well, this land isn't really important, we'll protect it. No, let's pick smaller areas that might include more biodiversity. And I think it's a good idea. Um, the original criteria for a hotspot included the presence of 1,500 or more species of endemic plants, and 70% of the area was disturbed by human activity. Currently, we have 34 biodiversity hotspots that contains large numbers of endemic species, including half of Earth's endemic plants. And so I think this is a better way of going about it than just randomly allocating land that might not actually be all that useful. So the last thing I want to talk about, just to leave us on a good note here, and there's a lot of more stuff I could have included in this, but I feel like it's better to just talk about some conservation wins. And you could find these yourself. In fact, all of these I'm going to talk about have happened within the last year. And so that really just sort of picked up my spirits a little bit because it's always tough to think about all of the bad stuff that's happening in terms of losing species and losing land, but there's a lot of good stuff that's going on as well. So, how about this one? Bison in the Badlands National Park, which we just talked about, now have an additional 22,553 acres to roam thanks to a bunch of passionate supporters who purchased the land and then purchased fencing materials to fence off that amount of acres, which is really, really great. More than 1 million acres of forest land in China is now managed responsibly or under improved forest management, thanks to WWF, World Wildlife Foundation, and Apple. How about this? In just over a year since it began, the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online has become the leading wildlife crime and tech industry partnership, with 34 of the world's top tech companies working together to stop wildlife tracking online. Um, how about this? So this is a picture of the use of drones, and you can use drones to track whales. And so this is really just a cool way of using technology to better our understanding of wildlife. What they'll take is they'll take digital tags that are attached to these drones, and they'll attach them to the whales that they normally couldn't get to, and it'll help us to track and study these humpback whales. So I just think that's really cool. Um, Here's some more wins. A major boost for communities and wildlife was happened in Zamibia as the Zamibian government halted plans to construct a mega hydropower dam across the river. So remember, we just talked about how damaging those dams can be, and really the benefits far less than how much damage they can do. So we stopped this mega hydropower dam from going across the river. How about the country of India conducted the world's largest tiger census in 2018, a process that was led by India's National Tiger Conservation Authority. What they found was that they found the number was 2,915 tigers, where they found only 2,226 in 2015. So something like 700 more tigers in just 2 years or 3 years of time. So that's a great sign. Um, through national parks, Peru's natural legacy, $140 million was given to permanently protect 41 million acres of the Peruvian Amazon, so the Amazon rainforest. And that's a huge thing. Like I just said, the Amazon, or the rainforests in general, are the most important biomes to protect. Here's a picture of something called a food forest. I don't know if you ever heard of a food forest, but they seem to be popping up all over the country. What they are is that they are this public park where you get access to natural free foods. And none of them have grown quite as large as this new urban food forest at Brown's Mill in Atlanta. It's a 7.1 acre property, which was once an abandoned urban farmland, and it's now a public park where community members with minimal access to fresh food can come and pick produce, nuts, herbs at zero cost, that's really great. They also have a space on site that has honey beehives and composting to provide more educational opportunities, and it'll eventually yield thousands of pounds of produce for residents to enjoy. So that's such a great story. And I think more stuff like this needs to happen. Remember, we talked about the vertical farms initiative, and I think things like this, along with vertical farms, could really transform the world as we know it. How about this last one I want to talk about? Along the southeast coast of Georgia, there's over 16,000 acres of prime deep water ecosystem, has sat unprotected and have been at serious risk for development. That size of land is roughly the size of the country Bermuda. This property features a remarkable mix of salt marsh, maritime forest, and fire-adapted longleaf pines. And it's also one of the most important habitats for the federally threatened gopher tortoise. You can see him here. That's a gopher tortoise. There's roughly 2,000 gopher tortoises that are estimated to populate that region of Georgia. And so this year, the Conservation Fund and the Open Space Institute purchased this property, and they'll continue to work with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources to establish new wildlife management areas, protecting it from future development and benefiting Navy operations on the coast. And so it's always great when government facilities and also concerned people that are concerned with wildlife can come together and figure out the best ways to preserve wildlife and preserve biodiversity. And with that, I'm going to let you guys go. It's been a great being able to teach you guys this semester. If you have any questions on this final topic, please let me know, and look forward to the next exam coming up as soon as I put it up online. So once again, I'll be reading emails, and feel free to send any questions you have to me. All right, bye then.